22 American soldiers walked into the briefing tent at Nui Dat Base, confident, capable, ready to prove themselves alongside their Australian allies. 30 minutes later, 19 of them were on their way back to their own compound, stripped of their weapons, told they were security risks, forbidden from entering Australian operational areas. The remaining 3, they stayed only because they had kept their mouths shut during the entire briefing. One word had ended the mission before it began. Cigarettes. A single American sergeant had asked if they could smoke during the patrol. The Australian SAS captain running the briefing didn't raise his voice, didn't lecture. He simply looked at the American lieutenant in charge and said 5 words that would echo through classified reports for the next decade. Your men just failed reconnaissance. Wait, failed? They hadn't even left the base, hadn't set foot in the jungle, hadn't fired a shot or missed a contact. How do you fail a mission that hasn't started? And why would asking about cigarettes, of all things, be grounds for immediate dismissal from a joint operation? Oh, this story cuts so much deeper than a question about smoking. Because what happened in that briefing tent in 1968 exposed a fundamental gap between American and Australian approaches to jungle warfare. A gap so vast that American commanders would spend years trying to bridge it, training thousands of soldiers in Australian methods, establishing entire schools dedicated to replicating what the SAS did naturally. And despite all that effort, despite all that training, most would never truly understand what made the Australians different. You're about to discover why a force of barely 120 men achieved what 500,000 Americans could not. Why the enemy called them Ma Rung, the Jungle Ghosts, and why, when Navy SEAL Roger Hayden spent 10 days with an Australian SAS patrol, he learned more about reconnaissance than he had in every American school combined. But here's the thing that will haunt you. He never heard them speak, not once. For 10 entire days, operating in enemy territory, the Australians communicated entirely through hand signals. No whispers, no radio static, no sound whatsoever. And Hayden, a man who had survived multiple tours, who had trained at Ranger School and Raider School, who belonged to one of America's most elite units, realized something that would change his understanding of special operations forever. The Americans had been playing at war. The Australians had become something else entirely. The meeting. Nobody expected Phuoc Tuy Province, March 1968. The jungle spread in every direction from Nui Dat Base like an ocean of green violence. American forces controlled the roads during daylight. The Viet Cong controlled everything else, especially the darkness. In between these two powers operated a third force, so small it barely registered on American organizational charts, but so effective that every intelligence officer in country knew their name. The Australian Special Air Service Regiment. 3 squadrons rotating through Vietnam. Never more than 120 men in country at any given time, achieving kill ratios that seemed mathematically impossible. The numbers told a story that American commanders struggled to accept. The SASR conducted nearly 1,200 patrols over 5 years. They killed at least 492 confirmed enemy soldiers, possibly as many as 598. They lost 2 men killed in action, 3 to friendly fire, 1 missing, 1 to illness, another 28 wounded. These weren't statistics from garrison duty or secure areas. These were results from long-range reconnaissance patrols deep in enemy-dominated territory, from ambushes in jungle so thick that visibility rarely exceeded 10 meters, from operations that lasted weeks without resupply or extraction options. American conventional units, by comparison, were achieving kill ratios of approximately 1-to-1. Even American Special Operations units, the highly trained LRRP teams, and MACVSOG operators were seeing ratios of 7-to-1 at best. The Australians were operating at a level that suggested either wildly inflated claims or a fundamental difference in operational methodology. American military intelligence suspected the latter. They wanted to know how. That's why Lieutenant James Ridgway of the 101st Airborne Division's Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol Detachment found himself standing outside a briefing tent at Nui Date on a morning where the humidity made breathing feel like drowning. His men, 22 of them, represented the cream of American LRRP capability, all volunteers, all Recondo School graduates, all experienced in jungle operations. They had been selected for a joint patrol with the Australian SAS, an opportunity to observe and learn from the unit that had become legendary throughout Vietnam. Ridgway had done his homework. He knew the Australians operated in 4- and 5-man patrols, far smaller than American doctrine recommended. He knew they spent weeks in the field without extraction. He knew they moved slower than any other unit, covering maybe 2 or 3 kilometers per day compared to the 10 or 15 American patrols managed. What he didn't know, what no amount of reading classified reports could have prepared him for, was the gulf between knowing about something and understanding it. The Australian captain waiting inside the tent was named David Mackenzie, though everyone called him Mac. 29 years old, lean in the way that jungle operations made men lean, with eyes that never quite stopped moving, even when his body remained still. He had completed 2 tours in Borneo during the Indonesian confrontation, learning to operate in triple canopy rainforest against an enemy that knew the terrain intimately. He had been in Vietnam for 7 months, running patrols into areas where American forces no longer ventured after taking catastrophic casualties. Mackenzie's briefing started normally enough. Maps spread on tables, overlays showing suspected enemy positions, radio frequencies and extraction protocols. Ridgway's men listened attentively, taking notes, asking the occasional technical question. They were good soldiers, disciplined, professional, everything American training produced. And that, as Mackenzie would later note in his after-action report, was precisely the problem. They had been trained. They had not been transformed. 45 minutes into the briefing, Sergeant First Class Ronald Becker raised his hand. Becker was experienced, a Korean War veteran with 2 tours in Vietnam already under his belt. His question seemed reasonable, practical even. "Sir, what's the smoking policy during patrol? Do we field strip butts or pack them out?" The Australian tent went silent, not the comfortable silence of men pausing to consider a question, the oppressive silence of an entire room recognizing a fundamental error. Mackenzie looked at Becker for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Ridgway. When he spoke, his voice carried no anger, no frustration, just the flat delivery of a man stating an obvious fact. "Your men just failed reconnaissance." Ridgway felt his stomach drop. "Sir, I don't understand. We haven't even—" "The fact that your sergeant is asking about smoking tells me everything I need to know about American patrol discipline." Mackenzie gestured to the map. "We're going into an area where the enemy has been operating for 20 years. They know every trail, every water source, every hiding spot. The only advantage we have is that they don't know we're there. And your man wants to light a cigarette?" "With respect, sir," Becker interjected, "I was asking about protocol. I wasn't saying I needed to smoke." "But you thought about it." Mackenzie's words landed like small arms fire. "You're standing here, about to walk into territory where one mistake means death, and some part of your brain is still concerned with when you can smoke. That tells me your head isn't where it needs to be." Another American soldier, a specialist named Kowalski, made the mistake of trying to defend his sergeant. "We all smoke, sir. It's just something soldiers do." Mackenzie nodded slowly. "Right. And how many of your mates have died because someone lit a cigarette at the wrong time? Because the enemy smelled tobacco smoke from 400 meters downwind? Because the glow of a cigarette drew fire in the darkness?" He paused. "You know what my men smell like after a week in the bush? Jungle, mud, rain, nothing else. You know what they think about? Their arc of observation, the next man's position, sounds that don't belong, not cigarettes, not food, not anything except staying alive and completing the mission." The briefing should have ended there. Mackenzie could have dismissed the entire American contingent, cited incompatible operational procedures, sent them back to their own commanders. But he did something else instead, something that would become a teaching moment, though not in any way the Americans expected. "Right," Mackenzie said, addressing the entire group. "New plan. We're going to run a simple test. 5 kilometers into the bush. Establish a listening post. Observe for 6 hours. Return. Basic reconnaissance. If you can do that to Australian standards, we'll talk about the longer patrol." The standard nobody met. They moved out at 0400 hours, before dawn broke over the South China Sea. The Australian patrol consisted of 5 men led by Mackenzie. The Americans numbered 22, divided into 4 teams based on their normal LRRP organization. The disparity in numbers alone should have told a story, but numbers were just the beginning. The first kilometer passed in what the Americans thought was acceptable silence. They moved carefully, avoiding obvious noise, communicating with hand signals when necessary. By American standards, particularly for a large unit, they were performing well. By Australian standards, they were broadcasting their presence like a brass band. Mackenzie halted the patrol after 90 minutes. They had covered barely half a kilometer. He gathered the group in a tight perimeter and began pointing out errors. The list was long, devastating. "Your point, man," Mackenzie addressed Ridgway, keeping his voice to a whisper that somehow still carried authority. "Just snapped 7 twigs. 7. Each one loud enough to hear from 50 meters in this canopy. Your number 2 man is breathing through his mouth. I can hear him from 3 meters back. Your number 4 has an unsecured buckle that rattles every 3rd step." He gestured to the American rucksacks. "Your packs are too high. They're catching on vines, making brush movement. Your weapons aren't taped properly. I've heard metal-on-metal contact 4 times. Your uniforms are American standard issue, which means they smell like American laundry soap. The VC know that smell. They've been fighting you for years." One of the younger Americans, a private named Chen, started to protest. "Sir, we passed Recondo School. We've been on Recondo School." Mackenzie's voice carried something close to contempt. 3 weeks of training. How long do you think our men train before they're allowed on operations?" "The course is 18 months, said one of the Australian SAS troopers, speaking for the first time. His name was Williams, and he looked like he had been carved from ironwood. 18 months minimum, and that's after selection. 1 in 12 candidates makes it through selection. 1 in 20 makes it through the full training pipeline. Mackenzie continued, "Your Recondo school teaches you to move through the jungle. We teach our men to become part of it. There's a difference." He pointed back the way they had come. "I can track this entire patrol's movement just from the disturbance you've left. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, boot prints in soft soil. The VC trackers, the good ones, they're better than me. They'll find your trail, follow it back to wherever you came from, and ambush your next patrol." "So what do we do?" Ridgway asked, and to his credit, there was no defensiveness in the question, just the genuine desire of a professional to learn. "Most of you go back to base." Mackenzie made it sound like a simple logistical decision, not a judgment on capability. "This isn't about being tough or brave. Your men have those qualities. This is about years of training and cultural adaptation that can't be compressed into a joint patrol. But I'll take 3 of you, the 3 who haven't made a sound this entire morning." The Americans looked at each other, trying to figure out who had maintained silence. Eventually, 3 men stepped forward. Chen, the private who had started to protest, a sergeant named Wilcox who had been walking drag, and a specialist named Ramirez who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else but was too disciplined to show it. "Why them?" Ridgway asked. "Because they didn't talk during the briefing, didn't ask questions, didn't try to defend themselves when I pointed out errors. They watched, they listened, they absorbed." Mackenzie looked at the 3 Americans. "That's the first requirement for reconnaissance, the ability to shut up and observe. Everything else can be taught." The 19 remaining Americans began the long walk back to Nui Dat, carrying with them a lesson about humility that no training manual could have conveyed. The 3 who remained had no idea they were about to receive an education in jungle warfare that would fundamentally alter their understanding of special operations. The silence that teaches. For the next 6 hours, Chen, Wilcox, and Ramirez learned what reconnaissance actually meant, not the American version where speed and firepower provided security, the Australian version where invisibility was the only security that mattered. Mackenzie positioned them in a listening post overlooking a trail junction that intelligence suggested saw regular Viet Cong traffic. The position offered excellent observation, but terrible cover if compromised, no easy withdrawal route, no artillery support within effective range, no helicopter extraction possible under the canopy. If they were discovered, their only option was to fight their way out against superior numbers with limited ammunition. It was, the Americans realized, exactly the kind of position that American doctrine would never occupy. Too risky, too isolated, too dependent on not being detected. "This is where we live," Williams whispered to Chen, who was positioned next to him. "Right in the middle of enemy territory. No backup, no quick extraction, just us and our ability to remain unseen." The first hour passed in what felt like suspended animation. The Australians didn't move, didn't adjust their positions, didn't scratch itches or shift weight or engage in any of the small movements that humans make unconsciously. They simply existed, part of the jungle, indistinguishable from the undergrowth. Chen, trained to American standards, found the stillness almost unbearable. His leg cramped. Insects crawled across his face. Sweat ran into his eyes. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to adjust, to do something to relieve the discomfort. But Williams, positioned 18 inches away, showed no such struggle. He could have been a statue. His eyes moved, constantly scanning his arc of responsibility, but nothing else betrayed his presence as a living creature. At hour 2, the lesson intensified. A Vietnamese woodcutter appeared on the trail, moving toward the junction with the unhurried pace of someone following a familiar route. He carried a machete and a bundle of cut bamboo. Appeared to be a civilian. Could have been a VC scout. The distinction, in this war, rarely mattered. The Americans watched Mackenzie for direction. Take him? Let him pass? The Australian captain did nothing, made no signal, simply observed as the woodcutter passed within 30 meters of their position, paused at the junction to adjust his load, and continued down the opposite trail. The entire encounter lasted perhaps 90 seconds. The woodcutter never glanced in their direction, never showed any awareness that 8 armed men were watching his every movement. When the Vietnamese had disappeared from sight, Mackenzie turned his head fractionally toward Chen and Williams. His lips moved in a whisper so soft it was barely vibration. "He's going to report our presence within the hour." Chen's eyes widened. "Report their presence? How?" The man had shown no indication of spotting them. Williams anticipated the question. His pause at the junction, too long. He was listening, smelling the air. "We're good, but we're not invisible." He detected something. Not enough to be certain, but enough to report. "So what do we do?" Chen breathed the question. "Nothing," Mackenzie replied. "We're not here to fight woodcutters. We're here to observe. If he reports, the VC will send a patrol to investigate. We'll observe that patrol, learn their patterns, their numbers, their equipment. That's intelligence, that's reconnaissance." It was a completely inverted paradigm from American operations. American units would have either captured the woodcutter for interrogation or let him pass, and immediately extracted to avoid compromise. The Australians did neither. They accepted the increased risk as part of the mission, trusting their field craft to keep them concealed even under heightened enemy awareness. At hour 4, the payoff arrived. A Viet Cong patrol appeared on the trail. 6 soldiers, armed with AK-47s and SKS rifles, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who knew the jungle intimately. They passed the junction, stopped, conferred quietly. One of them pointed in a direction that came uncomfortably close to the Australian position. The patrol began moving off the trail, into the bush, conducting what was clearly a search pattern. The Americans felt their hearts accelerate. This was it. Contact inevitable. Firefight coming. They prepared mentally for the explosion of violence that American training had conditioned them to expect. The Australians did something else. They became even more still, if such a thing was possible. Mackenzie's hand moved in a signal so small that Chen almost missed it. A finger twitch that somehow communicated volumes. Don't move, don't breathe, don't exist. The VC patrol moved closer, 40 meters, 30, 20, close enough that the Americans could see individual facial features, could hear conversations in Vietnamese, could smell the fish sauce and rice that marked their diet. One soldier passed within 5 meters of Williams' position, so close that a careless movement would have given away the entire team, and the soldier saw nothing, walked past 8 armed men as if they were part of the vegetation, continued his search pattern, eventually rejoined his patrol, shrugged, said something that made his comrades laugh. The patrol moved back to the trail and continued their route, disappearing into the jungle as quietly as they had arrived. Mackenzie waited another 30 minutes before moving. When he finally gave the signal to withdraw, the Americans realized they had been holding tension in muscles they didn't know they had. The relief of movement felt almost overwhelming. The education continues. They didn't return directly to Nui Dat. Mackenzie took them on what he called a debrief walk, a circuitous route that added 3 kilometers to their journey, but provided continuous teaching opportunities. He pointed out signs of enemy activity that the Americans had walked past without noticing, broken vegetation that indicated recent human passage, tree bark scraped in a pattern consistent with weapons being leaned against trunks, disturbed earth near the base of trees where soldiers had dug fighting positions months ago. The jungle tells stories, Williams explained to Chen as they moved. Everything leaves traces. The question is whether you can read them. American units move too fast. You cover ground quickly, which gives you the illusion of security through speed. But you miss everything. Miss the signs that tell you where the enemy was, where they're going, how many there are. So you move slow, Chen said. We move at the speed the jungle requires. Sometimes that's very slow. Sometimes we don't move at all for hours. Speed doesn't provide security in reconnaissance. Invisibility does. Ramirez, walking behind them, asked the question that had been bothering him since the listening post. That VC patrol, they were looking for us. They came within meters. How did they not see us? One of the other Australian SAS troopers, a corporal named Davidson, turned his head slightly. Because we're better at this than they are, and we've trained for it longer than you've been in the Army. It's not magic. It's not supernatural. It's just thousands of hours of practice until concealment becomes unconscious. Your body stops making the movements that betray presence. Your mind stops processing discomfort as something requiring action. You become part of the environment rather than something moving through it. How long does that take? For some men, it never happens. They wash out of training or get reassigned to conventional units. For others, maybe a year of constant operations. By the time you've been doing this for 3 years, 5 years, it's just who you are. Mackenzie added his own perspective. American special operations train you to be better soldiers, better shooters, better tacticians, better at calling in fire support. All valuable skills. But we train our men to become different creatures entirely, to think like prey animals while acting like predators, to embrace the vulnerability of being alone in enemy territory, and use it as motivation for absolute discipline. They reached a stream crossing, and here Mackenzie provided another demonstration that would stay with the Americans for the rest of their lives. The stream was perhaps 10 meters wide, ankle to knee deep, with a rocky bottom that would provide decent footing. An American patrol would have crossed quickly, maintaining security on both banks, minimizing time exposed in the open. Mackenzie stopped them 30 meters from the stream bank. "How would you cross this?" he asked Wilcox. The sergeant thought about it, applying his recondo school training. 2 men cross first, establish security on the far side. Rest of the patrol crosses in pairs, maintaining spacing. Last 2 men cross together. Standard bounding overwatch. Time required? 5 minutes, maybe less. And noise level? Wilcox hesitated. Some splashing, water movement, but minimal. Mackenzie nodded. Right. Now, watch how we do it. The Australian patrol approached the stream with the same glacial patience they applied to everything else. Mackenzie spent 20 minutes observing the far bank through binoculars, not just looking, but reading, studying vegetation patterns, watching for birds that might be disturbed by hidden observers, listening for sounds that didn't belong. When he was satisfied, he moved to the stream edge and entered the water with movements so controlled that the surface barely rippled. Each foot placement was deliberate, testing for stable rocks before committing weight. He crossed in a diagonal pattern that minimized his splash and kept him below the sight line of the banks. The entire crossing took 15 minutes. He emerged on the far side without having made a sound louder than flowing water. Each subsequent Australian crossed the same way. By the time Williams, the last man, started across, 45 minutes had elapsed. The 3 Americans, watching this display of obsessive caution, began to understand something fundamental about the difference in operational philosophy. "You think we're paranoid," Davidson said, reading their expressions. "You think this level of caution is excessive." "It seems," Chen searched for a diplomatic word, "thorough." "There are American patrols that have been ambushed at stream crossings. You know this. You've probably heard the stories. Men caught in the open, pinned down by fire from both banks. No cover, no options. Bad way to die. So you take 45 minutes to cross 10 meters of water. So we never get ambushed at stream crossings. See the difference?" When the Americans began their own crossing, trying to mimic the Australian technique, Mackenzie corrected them constantly. "Too fast. You're rushing. Every splash is a signal. Every ripple is a sign. Slower. Think about every movement before you make it." By the time all 3 Americans had crossed, over an hour had passed. They were exhausted not from physical exertion, but from the mental effort of maintaining absolute control over every action, and they had only crossed stream. "This is what reconnaissance means at our level," Mackenzie told them as they prepared to move out from the far bank. "Absolute commitment to remaining undetected. It's exhausting. It's mentally brutal. Most men can't maintain this level of discipline for hours, let alone days or weeks. But if you can push through the discomfort and the boredom and the constant fear of making a mistake, you become invisible. And invisible men can go anywhere, see anything, survive situations that would kill conventional units. The final 3 kilometers back to Nui Dat took 5 hours. The Australians could have covered the distance in less than 1, if speed had been the priority. But speed was never the priority. Security through invisibility remained paramount until they were back inside the wire. The debrief that changed everything, Mackenzie's after-action report from the aborted Joint Patrol, would become one of the most widely read documents in Australian military archives. Copies found their way to American MACV headquarters, to the LRRP training wing, to Special Forces Command. The report was blunt, to the point of being harsh, but it was also constructive, offering insights that American training had completely missed. "American LRRP doctrine," Mackenzie wrote, "is built on the assumption that detection is inevitable and manageable through firepower superiority and rapid extraction. Australian SAS doctrine is built on the assumption that detection is a failure of reconnaissance and likely means mission termination or patrol elimination. These are fundamentally incompatible approaches," he continued. "American training produces excellent light infantry soldiers capable of reconnaissance operations. It does not produce reconnaissance specialists. The difference is profound. An infantry soldier conducting reconnaissance is still thinking like an infantry soldier. His instincts push toward confrontation, toward using his weapons, toward calling in support. A reconnaissance specialist thinks like a ghost. His instincts push toward avoidance, toward remaining unseen, toward gathering information without leaving trace." The report detailed the smoking incident, but framed it as symptomatic of a larger cultural issue. The fact That an experienced American NCO was thinking about cigarettes before a patrol indicates a training system that has not instilled absolute operational discipline. Our selection process eliminates candidates who cannot surrender comfort for mission security. American selection process appears to focus on physical capabilities and tactical skills while accepting psychological comfort-seeking as normal human behavior. Mackenzie's recommendations were equally blunt. Joint operations between American LRRP units and Australian SAS are inadvisable except in the most controlled circumstances. The security risk posed by different operational standards is too high. American units operate at a noise and sign discipline level that is acceptable for their doctrine, but unacceptable for ours. We cannot maintain invisibility while working with partners who maintain visibility. The report concluded with an observation that would prove prophetic. The Americans are attempting to learn our methods through short-term training courses and observation opportunities. This approach is fundamentally flawed. Our operational methodology cannot be learned in weeks or months. It requires years of conditioning that begins with selection and continues through every hour of training and every patrol. The Americans would need to completely restructure their special operations training pipeline to achieve parity with our reconnaissance standards. Given the scale of American military operations and their doctrinal commitment to firepower superiority, such restructuring is unlikely. When the report reached American commanders, reaction split along predictable lines. Some dismissed it as Australian arrogance, the posturing of a small unit trying to justify its existence. Others recognized it as a mirror being held up to American training inadequacies, reflecting truths that were uncomfortable to acknowledge. General Crichton Abrams, MACV commander, fell into the latter category. He had watched American units take catastrophic casualties in terrain where the Australians operated with impunity. He had studied the Australian kill ratios and found them credible when cross-referenced with enemy documents and signals intelligence. He understood that the Australians had discovered something that American military culture struggled to embrace. Patience and invisibility could be more deadly than firepower and aggression. Abrams ordered a comprehensive review of LRRP training across all American units in Vietnam. The review found exactly what Mackenzie's report suggested. American training produced tactically proficient soldiers capable of reconnaissance but not reconnaissance specialists. The training timeline was too compressed. The selection criteria focused too much on physical attributes and too little on psychological suitability. The operational doctrine provided too many backup options, which created dependency on support rather than self-sufficiency. Changes were implemented, LRRP courses were extended, selection criteria were revised to emphasize patience and discipline. Australian SAS instructors were brought in to teach at the MACV Recondo School and the LRRP Training Wing. The improvements were real and measurable. American reconnaissance capabilities improved significantly in the final years of the war. But they never achieved parity with the Australians. The cultural gap was too wide, the training timeline difference too significant, and perhaps most importantly, the operational philosophy remained fundamentally different. American forces continued to emphasize firepower and rapid extraction as primary security measures. The Australians continued to emphasize invisibility and avoidance. The legend of 10 silent days. The story of the aborted joint patrol spread through the American Special Operations community like wildfire. Most heard it as a cautionary tale about different operational standards. Some heard it as a challenge. A few heard it as an opportunity to learn from the best. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden was one of the few. Serving with SEAL Team 1 in 1969, he had already completed 2 tours in Vietnam and survived more close calls than he cared to remember. He had been to Ranger School. He had trained at Raider School. He had worked with MICV SOG and provincial reconnaissance units. He considered himself among the elite of American special operations. But he had heard enough stories about the Australian SAS to recognize that there might be another level entirely. When an opportunity arose to join an Australian patrol operating in the U Minh forest, Hayden volunteered immediately. The U Minh was notorious, a vast mangrove swamp where the Viet Cong had operated with impunity for decades. American units avoided it when possible. The Australians treated it like their personal hunting preserve. What Hayden experienced during his 10 days with the SAS would become the subject of a podcast interview decades later, where he would tell host Jocko Willink, "I learned more about reconnaissance in those 10 days than I did in every American school combined. And you know what the crazy part was? They never spoke, not once. For 10 entire days, we communicated entirely through hand signals and touch. No whispers, no radio static, no sound at all except what the jungle made naturally. The patrol operated in enemy territory, often within a few hundred meters of Viet Cong base camps. They watched enemy movements, counted troops, identified equipment, gathered intelligence that would later result in successful operations by conventional forces. And through it all, they remained absolutely invisible. Hayden described the experience as transformative and humbling in equal measure. "I thought I was good," he told Willink. "I thought SEALs were the best. And then I spent 10 days with these Australian operators and realized we had been playing at being quiet. They were actually quiet. There's a difference." He detailed the fieldcraft that made this possible. Their uniforms were broken in to the point of being threadbare. No starch, no chemicals, just cloth that moved silently and smelled like jungle. Their equipment was taped and padded to eliminate any metal-on-metal contact. Their boots had the soles cut off and replaced with tire rubber, so their tracks looked like Vietnamese sandal prints. Every single piece of gear had been modified based on years of operational experience. But the modifications went deeper than equipment. They moved differently, Hayden explained. American operators move like soldiers trying to be quiet. These guys moved like they were part of the environment, fluid, natural, no wasted motion, and the patience. Jesus, the patience. We'd stop moving and just sit there for hours, watching, listening. No fidgeting, no adjusting position, just absolute stillness. I've never seen anything like it before or since. The patrol commander, whose name Hayden never learned because names were never used in the field, demonstrated tracking abilities that seemed almost supernatural. He could tell you how many men had passed on a trail, how long ago, what kind of weapons they were carrying, all from signs I couldn't even see. He'd get down on his hands and knees, smell the ground, touch vegetation, and just know things. It wasn't magic. It was years of experience and training that American forces didn't have the patience to develop. Near the end of the patrol, Hayden witnessed something that encapsulated the Australian approach. A Viet Cong patrol passed within arm's reach of their position. "I'm not exaggerating," he told Willink. "One of their soldiers walked past me so close I could have reached out and touched him, and he never saw us. 5 men lying in the vegetation, armed to the teeth, and this guy walked right past. That's when I understood the level these operators were working at. It wasn't human, or rather, it was human potential pushed to an extreme that American training never approached. When the patrol finally extracted after 10 days, Hayden returned to his SEAL team with a completely different perspective on special operations. He tried to implement some of what he had learned with mixed success. The cultural barriers were too significant. American units were built around aggressive action and firepower superiority. The patience and discipline required for Australian-level reconnaissance didn't fit into American operational timelines or command expectations. I came back and told everyone what I'd seen, Hayden remembered. Some believed me. Most thought I was exaggerating. A few got angry, like I was insulting American capabilities, but I wasn't insulting anyone. I was just being honest. The Australians were operating at a level we didn't understand, and until American military culture could embrace the idea that sometimes the best action is no action, that sometimes the best fight is the one you avoid completely, we'd never reach that level. The cultural divide that couldn't be bridged. The fundamental question that American military analysts struggled with was simple to articulate but impossible to answer. Why were the Australians so much better at reconnaissance? What combination of selection, training, culture, and operational experience produced such dramatically superior results? The easy answer was training duration. Australian SAS operators spent 18 months in training before their first operational deployment. American LRRP personnel typically spent 3 weeks at Recon school and perhaps another month in unit-level training. The time difference was staggering, but time alone didn't explain the gap. Australian selection criteria were different. American special operations focused on physical capabilities. Can you ruck long distances with heavy loads? Can you endure sleep deprivation? Can you navigate under stress? All important attributes, but not the full picture. Australian selection added psychological dimensions that American programs didn't measure. Patience, tolerance for boredom, ability to remain still under discomfort, capacity for sustained observation without stimulation. One Australian SAS instructor interviewed years after the war described the difference. Americans select for action. We select for patience. Both are necessary, but if you're building reconnaissance specialists, patience is primary. A patient man can learn to act decisively. An action-oriented man struggles to learn patience. The cultural context mattered as well. Australian military culture had evolved from frontier experiences where small numbers of men operated in vast, hostile territories with minimal support. The Boer War, the Malayan Emergency, the Indonesian confrontation. Each conflict reinforced the same lessons. Patience, fieldcraft, and invisibility provide security when firepower and numbers are unavailable. American military culture evolved from different experiences: industrial warfare, mass mobilization, overwhelming force. The lessons of World War II and Korea emphasized firepower, logistics, and technological superiority. These were valid lessons that won wars, but they didn't translate well to the reconnaissance requirements of Vietnam. The doctrinal differences created incompatible operational approaches. American doctrine accepted detection as likely and provided extensive support to deal with contact situations, artillery on call, air support overhead, rapid extraction capabilities. These were reasonable measures given the scale of American operations and the resources available. Australian doctrine treated detection as a reconnaissance failure to be avoided through superior fieldcraft, no artillery support, limited air assets, extraction dependent on maintaining concealment until reaching secure areas. These measures forced Australian operators to develop capabilities that American forces could rely on support to provide. Neither approach was inherently superior. They represented different solutions to the reconnaissance problem based on available resources and operational contexts. But in the specific circumstances of Vietnam, particularly in the dense jungle and enemy-controlled areas, the Australian approach produced better results. The Americans recognized this. They attempted to learn from it. But institutional changes happened slowly, if they happened at all. Training pipelines couldn't be lengthened without reducing throughput. Selection criteria couldn't be radically changed without alienating recruiting bases. Operational doctrine couldn't shift away from firepower superiority without contradicting decades of military culture. So instead, American forces created specialized units that attempted to bridge the gap. MACVSOG pushed operators toward more extended deployments and riskier missions. LRRP companies incorporated Australian instructors and techniques into their training. Individual commanders with vision implemented changes at unit level, creating pockets of excellence that approached Australian standards. But these were islands of capability in an ocean of conventional doctrine. The average American unit never reached Australian reconnaissance standards. Most never tried. The resource investment required seemed excessive when firepower and technology could compensate for shortfalls in fieldcraft. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the story. Military excellence isn't universal. It exists in specific contexts, developed through specific experiences, suited to specific operational requirements. The Australian SAS excelled at reconnaissance in jungle environments because their entire organizational culture was built around that mission. American forces excelled at combined arms operations with joint support because their organizational culture was built around that paradigm. The cigarette question at Nui Dat wasn't really about smoking. It was about incompatible operational philosophies revealing themselves through a simple query. An American soldier thinking about comfort in the field wasn't wrong. He was just conditioned by a system that provided more support and therefore required less absolute discipline. An Australian officer rejecting that soldier wasn't being harsh. He was maintaining standards that had been developed through years of operations where any lapse could mean death. The numbers don't lie. By the time the last Australian SAS squadron departed Vietnam in October 1971, the statistical record told a story that military historians still study. Nearly 1,200 patrols conducted over 6 years, operating primarily in Puoc Tuy Province, but also in Bien Hoa, Long Can, and Binh Tuy provinces, areas where the Viet Cong had operated for decades, terrain that American conventional forces found nearly impenetrable. The confirmed results: 492 enemy killed, with another 106 possibly killed, 47 wounded, 10 possibly wounded, 11 prisoners captured. These numbers, verified through post-war analysis of Vietnamese documents, represented the highest kill ratio of any Allied unit in the entire war, not just among special operations units, any unit. The cost: 2 men killed in action, 3 killed by friendly fire, 1 missing, 1 death from illness, 28 wounded. These losses, while tragic for the families affected and the tight-knit SAS community, were remarkably low given the operational tempo and level of risk. The comparison to American results becomes stark when examined in detail. Conventional American units typically operated at kill ratios close to 1-to-1, meaning they suffered nearly as many casualties as they inflicted. Even elite American units rarely exceeded 7-to-1. The Australian SAS was operating at levels approaching 30-to-1 or higher, depending on how you calculated the figures. Some American analysts suggested these numbers must be inflated, that the Australians were overcounting enemy dead or claiming kills that couldn't be verified. But post-war access to Vietnamese records confirmed the Australian figures were, if anything, conservative. The Viet Cong's D-445 Battalion, which operated in Australian areas of responsibility, kept meticulous records of their losses. Those records matched Australian claims with remarkable accuracy. The psychological impact was even more significant than the body count. Captured Vietnamese documents described the Australians as Ma Rung, jungle ghosts, or phantoms of the jungle. Political officers reported difficulty maintaining morale in units operating in areas where the SAS was known to patrol. Desertion rates spiked. Soldiers refused night patrol assignments. Some units performed elaborate spiritual rituals before entering zones where the phantoms had been reported. This psychological effect multiplied the Australians' physical impact. A 5-man SAS patrol didn't just eliminate enemy soldiers, it degraded enemy operational effectiveness across entire regions. Supply routes were abandoned, training areas were relocated, base camps were moved to less optimal positions, all because the enemy feared encountering an invisible threat they couldn't defend against. American forces generated similar psychological effects in some areas, particularly Macy v. SOG operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But the scale was different. American operations were episodic, high-intensity events separated by periods of reduced activity. Australian operations were continuous, low-intensity pressure that never relented. The enemy never knew when or where the next patrol would appear. That sustained uncertainty proved devastating to morale and operational planning. The broader question remained: if the Australians could achieve such results with barely 120 men deployed at any given time, what could have been accomplished if these methods were applied at scale across American forces? The Pentagon never pursued that question seriously because the answer was uncomfortable. Applying Australian methods at American scale would require fundamental restructuring of training, selection, and operational doctrine. The institutional investment would be enormous, the cultural resistance would be fierce, and there was no guarantee that the same results could be replicated outside the specific context of Australian military culture. So instead, the Australian success became a case study, a data point in broader analysis of special operations in counterinsurgency warfare. Tactically brilliant, operationally successful, strategically interesting, but not paradigm-shifting. American forces continued developing their own approaches, which eventually led to the creation of Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, and other specialized units that incorporated some Australian lessons while maintaining fundamentally American operational approaches. The legacy that lasted. The aborted joint patrol at Nui Dat in March 1968 wasn't the last interaction between American and Australian Special Operations Forces. Joint operations continued throughout the war, though with more careful screening of participants and clearer understanding of operational compatibility issues. Some American units reached high levels of proficiency, particularly those that spent extended time training with Australian instructors or operating in areas where Australian standards were required for survival. Navy SEAL Roger Hayden's experience became one of many anecdotes that circulated through American special operations, a reminder that there were always higher levels of skill to pursue. The story of 10 silent days in the U Min Forest became legendary among SEALs, a benchmark of fieldcraft that few would ever approach, but everyone could aspire toward. The 3 Americans who completed the abbreviated patrol with Captain Mackenzie, Chen, Wilcox, and Ramirez all went on to distinguished careers in special operations. Chen stayed in the Army, eventually serving with the newly formed Delta Force in the 1970s, where he became known as a proponent of the Australian approach to reconnaissance. Wilcox returned to the 101st Airborne and implemented training changes in his unit based on what he had learned, reducing casualty rates and improving intelligence collection. Ramirez left the military after Vietnam, but later became an instructor at various special operations schools, where he taught generations of operators about the importance of patience and discipline in reconnaissance operations. The cigarette question became shorthand in American special operations circles. When units prepared for sensitive operations requiring absolute stealth, commanders would ask, "Anyone need to know about cigarettes?" It was a reminder that comfort and mission security were incompatible in reconnaissance work, a cultural callback to the lesson learned at Nui Dat. Australian SAS veterans carried different lessons forward. For them, the incident confirmed what they already knew. Their training and standards existed at a level most conventional forces couldn't reach. It wasn't arrogance, it was simply recognition of specialization. Not everyone could be a reconnaissance specialist, just as not everyone could be a jet pilot or a surgeon. The skills required were too specific, the training too intensive, the psychological demands too extreme. Captain David Mackenzie left the Army in 1973 and largely disappeared from public view. He never wrote memoirs or gave interviews about his Vietnam service. The official historical record shows he commanded multiple successful operations, received several commendations for valor, and was regarded by his peers as one of the finest reconnaissance operators of his generation. His after-action reports from Vietnam remain classified in parts, but the portions that have been released reveal a thoughtful, analytical approach to special operations that influenced Australian doctrine for decades. The broader legacy of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam extends beyond specific tactical lessons. They demonstrated that small, highly trained units operating with absolute discipline could achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their size. That patience and invisibility could be more deadly than firepower and aggression. That selection and training standards mattered more than equipment or technology. These lessons influenced the development of special operations forces worldwide. Modern special operations training incorporates many elements first refined by the Australian SAS in Vietnam: extended patrol operations, emphasis on stealth over speed, selection criteria that measure psychological attributes alongside physical capabilities, training pipelines measured in years rather than weeks. The specific techniques have evolved with technology and changing operational environments, but the underlying philosophy remains remarkably consistent with what the Australians practiced in the jungles of Huoc Tuy province. Yet something has been lost in the translation. The transformation that turned Australian sheep farmers and factory workers into jungle phantoms represented a complete immersion in a way of operating that modern militaries struggle to replicate. The psychological shift from thinking like a soldier to thinking like a predator. The acceptance of extreme discomfort as normal the patience to remain motionless for hours while watching enemy movements from meters away. These capabilities exist in modern special operations forces, but perhaps not at the same level or with the same consistency that the Australian SAS demonstrated in Vietnam. The institutional knowledge is there. The techniques are documented. The training methodologies are understood. What's harder to replicate is the culture that produced such consistent excellence. A military culture that valued patience over action, that measured success in intelligence gathered rather than enemies killed, that selected for psychological attributes that most military systems don't test for and don't value in conventional operations. The final assessment. The story that began with 22 Americans being dismissed from a joint patrol because one sergeant asked about cigarettes is ultimately about the nature of military excellence and the difficulty of achieving it. The Australians weren't superhuman. They were products of a specific training system, operational culture, and institutional philosophy that had been refined over decades of small wars and frontier operations. The Americans weren't incompetent. They were products of a different system, optimized for different operational requirements. Neither approach was universally superior. In open terrain with strong logistical support and air superiority, American methods produced devastating results. In dense jungle without support and surrounded by enemies who knew the terrain intimately, Australian methods proved more effective. The mistake was assuming that excellence in one operational context would automatically transfer to another. The lesson Mackenzie tried to impart to Lieutenant Ridgway's patrol wasn't that American soldiers were inadequate. It was that reconnaissance is a specialized skill set requiring specialized training over extended timelines. A 3-week course and a few months of unit-level training couldn't replicate what Australian operators developed over 18 months of initial training and years of operational experience. The cigarette question exposed this gap not because wanting to smoke was somehow wrong, but because thinking about cigarettes before a patrol indicated mental processes that were incompatible with Australian reconnaissance standards. An Australian operator preparing for a patrol wasn't thinking about comfort at all. His mind was already in the jungle, already planning routes and contingencies, already adapting his psychology to the requirements of invisibility. That psychological adaptation is the real secret of Australian success. Equipment can be copied. Techniques can be learned. Tactics can be studied and implemented. But the mental transformation that allows a human being to remain motionless for hours while mosquitoes feed on exposed skin, while cramps build in immobile muscles, while every instinct screams to move or scratch or adjust position, that transformation requires a level of training intensity and duration that most military organizations cannot or will not provide. The numbers prove the results. Nearly 500 confirmed enemy killed, 2 men lost in combat, a kill ratio approaching 250 to 1. These statistics represent the outcome of absolute commitment to reconnaissance as a specialized discipline. They also represent something unreplicable in most modern military contexts: the operational environment that created the Australian SAS approach in Vietnam. Small numbers, limited support, enemy-dominated terrain, extended operations rarely exists in contemporary warfare. So we study the history, we learn the lessons, we incorporate what we can into modern training. But we also recognize that some achievements represent peaks that emerge from unique combinations of circumstance, culture, and commitment. The Australian SAS in Vietnam was such a peak, not because Australians were inherently better soldiers, but because their military had developed a training system and operational culture specifically optimized for the reconnaissance mission in austere environments. And sometimes excellence in one specific area means accepting limitations in others. The Australians couldn't field large conventional forces. They couldn't provide extensive fire support. They couldn't sustain major offensive operations. What they could do, better than anyone else in Vietnam, was gather intelligence while remaining invisible. They chose to be exceptional at that specific mission rather than merely competent at a broader range of missions. That focus, that specialization, that commitment to excellence in a narrow domain, these are the real lessons of the story. Not that Americans failed at reconnaissance, but that reconnaissance requires specialization. Not that Australian methods were universally applicable, but that operational success requires matching methods to missions. Not that one approach was right and another wrong, but that different operational contexts demand different capabilities developed through different training philosophies. 22 Americans walked into a briefing tent at Nui Dat expecting to join an Australian patrol. 19 walked out, having learned that there are levels of military excellence that exist beyond conventional training. 3 stayed and received an education in reconnaissance that would influence American special operations for generations. One sergeant's question about cigarettes exposed a fundamental gap in operational philosophy that armies are still trying to bridge. And somewhere in the classified archives, Captain Mackenzie's after-action report remains, a testament to a unit that achieved results out of proportion to its size by committing absolutely to specialization. The jungle ghosts of Phuoc Tuy Province, the Ama Rung who made the enemy fear darkness and silence, the operators who proved that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't the one that makes the most noise, but the one that makes no noise at all. That's the lesson that survives decades after the last Australian patrol left Vietnam. That's the standard that remains aspirational for special operations forces worldwide. That's why a simple question about cigarettes became a moment of recognition that excellence exists at levels most organizations never pursue. Because pursuing those levels requires commitment that most are unwilling or unable to make. And without that commitment, all the tactics and techniques and equipment in the world won't bridge the gap between competence and exceptional.